Welcome back. I'm Stephanie Ruhle. President Trump says it is very sad that his former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, will be spending the next 6+ years of his life in jail on charges of fraud and conspiracy. But within hours of his sentencing in D.C., Manafort was hit with state charges in New York. The indictment is seen as a strategy for preventing a presidential pardon, which would not excuse Manafort from state felonies. I want to bring in NBC's intelligence and national security reporter, my friend Ken Dilanian. Caroline Polisi, a federal and white-collar criminal defense attorney who currently serves as a lawyer for George Papadopoulos. Robert Bianchi, a criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor, and Dan Alonso, managing director and general counsel at Exeter. He previously served in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District of New York. Ken, walk me through these new charges.
So it's a 16-count indictment, Stephanie, involving mortgage fraud, falsification of business records. It involves transactions that were part of the Mueller investigation, and many of them were actually entered into evidence in the Manafort's Virginia trial. And so some legal experts have raised the question of double jeopardy. We have this principle that you can't be charged twice for the same crime in the United States. But it's common, though, for you to face state charges on the same fact pattern as federal charges. But New York has a tougher standard of double jeopardy. Nonetheless, the Manhattan District Attorney believes that he will prevail. It's also important to note, Stephanie, that these state charges, I think, loom larger in importance today because we're learning that the top prosecutor in the Manafort case, Mueller's top prosecutor, is leaving his office.
How do we read that?
It's the latest sign. I've just confirmed that with a source close to Andrew Weissman.
I'm saying, how should we read that? How should we interpret Weissman leaving?
Well, it's, I think, the latest sign that the Mueller investigation is reaching its end. But what that doesn't mean is that the criminal investigations into Donald Trump and the people around him are at an end. And this New York case is a great example of that. And there's also a couple of pending investigations in the Southern District of New York. But it is pretty clear that on the Russia question, Robert Mueller is wrapping up, and we expect a report from Mueller to go to the Department of Justice really any day now, Stephanie.
Dan, you work for Cy Vance. What's his strategy here?
Well, stressing that I haven't spoken to him about this, I can only conclude that his strategy in doing something which is quite unusual is to prevent against the possibility of a presidential pardon causing a miscarriage of justice with Mr. Manafort. So I think this was strictly a prophylactic indictment. It would not happen ordinarily.
Manafort's team is going to say double jeopardy. Will they be successful?
Well, here's the thing. Right now in the United States Supreme Court, the Trump administration is arguing against eliminating double jeopardy in these cases. They're saying that the sovereign doctrine, which is that the federal and the state should be able to prosecute their crimes as they see fit, was just argued before the Supreme Court, Stephanie, in December. And interestingly, justices like Alito and Kavanaugh and Kagan and the more liberal judges are all saying, you're asking us to turn around a 170-year-old doctrine that allows the state and the feds to be able to prosecute as they see fit. The challenge here is that New York State has a law that gives greater protection to defendants. That's why you see District Attorney Vance was very narrow in only charging state crimes like residential mortgage fraud, which were not included in the federal indictment, so that he can say these crimes were not similar, they're not the same, they're separate, and therefore it does not implicate double jeopardy. The last point I have to say, I've been saying this forever. The state crimes bypass the pardon power and the DOJ memo that says you can't indict a sitting president. If I were the boss sitting there tactically with the feds, I'd say, look, with Trump Organization, with the charity, with those kind of things that have nothing to do with Russian collusion, let us take it. This way, the president can't end run the case.
All right, then do you think Cy Vance's indictments and his strategy here are going to work and they will stave off the possibility that the president will try to pardon Paul Manafort?
I think potentially it could work. I think that it's in all likelihood the office is coordinated with each other in terms of, yes, the way the federal indictments were charged, very, very narrowly tailored to allow for this other state charge. I do think that this looks a bit political on Cy Vance's part. I think that, if there is not a pardon, the question is
clearly
right,
political.
The question is, is he wasting prosecutorial reresources on a man that is going to spend likely the rest of his life in prison?
Why is he going to spend the rest of his life in prison? He's only 70.
Well, 7.5 years.
He's going to get pardoned.
Potentially. Potentially.
And it's likely he's going to get pardoned. This is the point. If you're dealing
If my parents are watching, who are in their mid-70s, I hope you're okay. 7 years. I mean, come on.
When you're talking about Jared and Ivanka and Trump Jr. and some of these other investigations that were given to the Southern District, look, they're great prosecutors, but the bottom line is they have the ability, they suffer the pardon power, and there's no question in my mind that that's what the president will do. So tactically, as prosecutors, you give the crimes to the jurisdiction that bypass the pardon power, and that's the state attorney general and the district attorneys. The state attorney generals are already gone after Trump with regard to the Trump Foundation and basically wrote a press release that sounds close to an indictment.
Except what does that actually mean? We sat here going, you've got to be kidding me with what happened with the Trump charity. I mean, awful, humiliating. They can't even touch a foundation for 10 years. Except, does it really matter? Jared's still sitting in his job, Ivanka is still sitting in her job, and Don Jr. is probably hate tweeting at this very moment. So yes, that terrible thing happened, but did it really impact them?
Well, from the point of the state of New York, sure, and that's a pretty big deal to get barred from charitable boards, to have a charity essentially disbanded. That's a pretty rarely used power of the Attorney General. So I think it's a pretty big deal, just legally. It's not a criminal case, right? So that's a pretty big distinction. In fact, the New York Attorney General generally doesn't have criminal jurisdiction, just with a few exceptions.
Didn't make Ivanka Trump lose her job as the senior advisor to the President of the United States.
Well, that's up to her boss.
And we have to keep in mind that because people think that this is so political, Stephanie, but a lot of times as a state prosecutor, we were prosecuting people for frauds that were in the area of $75,000, $80,000, $90,000, and they were going to state prison. So when people want to say, oh, this is just political and they're going after them for no reason, a guy like Paul Manafort, with the break that he got on the sentence that he got in the Eastern District, this, in my jurisdiction, the guy would have been looking at a prison sentence of 10 years.
Yeah, but that's not true in Manhattan. I would not expect him to get any more time in Manhattan. Maybe even if he gets sentenced, it could well run concurrently. I mean, New York judges are not the strongest sentencing judges.
I'm just trying to point out that people that do far less get the same kind of time.
Okie doke. Roger Stone, he's going to appear before Judge Jackson today. They're working on getting a trial date for charges lying to Congress and obstruction of justice. What are you expecting?
Well, remember, Judge Jackson made a very definitive statement the last time Roger Stone was hauled into the courtroom for posting an Instagram photograph of her with a
statement wasn't punishment.
Correct.
He's still walking in a free man. He didn't sleep in jail last night.
Absolutely. But remember, she said this isn't baseball. You don't get 3 strikes, right? The next time this happens, I could potentially throw you in jail. I think it's a little bit of a nuanced question in that the new statement, as it were, is the publication of this book, right? The republication of a book that came out previously. And the question is whether or not that violates the existing, gag order that she imposed, which was now ratcheted up to literally no statements that he's allowed to make about the case. I tend to think this is not going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back, but one more offense like this and he's going to jail.
Well, we'll soon find out. All right, quite an hour. Thank you all so much.